Hi there. This video is part two of the Church of Nowhere and its attitude towards metaphysics. And I just briefly, though, want to answer the question about why a church. Well, church is really just a sort of community of people that believe that it's of significance or has something of value to say or something of value to share with its members and with the larger community of which it is a part. So that's why the word church is perfectly appropriate in this case, I feel. The Church of Nowhere, and I've already explained why the Church of Nowhere is called the Church of Nowhere, and not as originally called the Church of Nothing, because I think that's a little bit too negative. And the Church of Nowhere would be uh, thinking about positive things rather than negative things, although its moral pronouncement would suggest a critique of society in general, and in particular, certain aspects of society seem to come under a lot of criticism from the implications of what the church aspires to, such as the vegan utopia on one hand, which you've already explained about, and on minimal living and the utopia of minimal living on the other, and even of antinatalism. So, be that as it may, this video is really about metaphysics and the church's critique of metaphysics. Now, one of the things about metaphysics and about what lies behind a lot of religion is a sort of I don't put a label on it because it would be an inaccurate label, but let us take you on a sort of journey, a metaphysical journey, which assumes the existence of a thing called soul. Okay, and originally, as far as I understand it, soul was living in perfection, in a realm of perfection, and the myth goes, as far as I understand it, the myth goes that soul didn't realize that it was living in a realm of perfection. It didn't realize how well off it was living in perfection and strumming on a harp and having angels sing to it. So soul basically was just. So the Father, the God, basically, he fixed it all up so that the soul would fall out of heaven and go into a series or concentric circles, a structure of concentric circles of lower worlds, so called. This is the higher world of perfection, and these are the lower worlds of imperfection. And basically, these worlds are worlds of a mixture of creation, preservation, and destruction, a mixture of pleasure and suffering, and the juxtaposition of pleasure and suffering, on the fact that suffering can flip over to pleasure, and pleasure can flip over to suffering. There's a pleasure in asceticism, for example, but there's also a suffering involved in it as well. So often, you got this in the dualistic worlds. These are also dualistic worlds. There's always more than one way of looking at something. So a circumstance, a situation arises, and there's always, well, perhaps two or more ways of looking at the situation or circumstance and or thing itself. And all this is part of what the soul has come down to these lower worlds to experience suffering within pleasure, pleasure within suffering, dualism in general. And it's supposed to experience this one way of many ways of looking at the same thing, for example. And eventually, the story goes that when the soul has learned all its lessons, has learned how to cope with the dualistic world it lives in, how to cope with pleasure and pain, how to cope with the juxtaposition of pleasure and pain one to the other, And when soul has actually learnt all these lessons, soul, and by which is meant the sort of collective soul of humankind, will return by a long and circuitous route to the perfection, the heavenly realm, which it was in before, but didn't sort of realize it was in before, and certainly didn't appreciate it was in before, because it didn't have any idea of anything other than its perfection, or its place in perfection, and its place in relationship to the God of goodness, to the God of non-dualism, to the God where pleasure and pain have no meaning, because because they live in a non-dualistic world. And this seems to me to be a jolly queer way of looking at cosmology, or the transfiguration or transformation of soul. I mean, you know, what would possibly motivate soul, or what would possibly motivate God, for example, to cast soul out into the lower worlds, in order for soul to go back, in order for soul to have some kind of knowledge and experience of life, of dualistic life, in order to learn something. I mean, what lesson is there to be learnt, really? You just suffer, and you just experience dualism, and you just have the occasional pleasure and numinous or peak experience, and all that is supposed to prepare you for a return journey to perfection. And when you get to perfection, presumably, you sort of can remember the days of imperfection. You can sort of remember the days of suffering in duality and pleasure and pain and all that, and you think, "Oh, I'm jolly glad to be here, because it's not like it was down there." And so God, who fixed all this to happen, has made you a wiser soul. But I mean, if you had perfect wisdom in the first place, it doesn't make much sense for you to have imperfect wisdom, or foolishness, or foolhardiness, in order to appreciate wisdom. I mean, why couldn't you have appreciated wisdom before? This whole story seems to me to be completely rooted, I think, in dualism to start with. The whole thing is dualism, because you start off with the dualism between perfection and imperfection. And in order to experience perfection, you have to experience imperfection. And so this good God fixes it so that you fall down into the pit of despond, and despair, and disassociation, if you like, in order to kind of appreciate what you've got when you've got it back again. I mean, I suppose it's a bit like the old age-old sort of love story, isn't it? Girl meets boy, girl loses boy, girl finds boy again, and so therefore, she can appreciate the finding of the boy again, in order well, because it was not very nice without the boy. So when she finds the boy again, there's reconciliation between the two parties, if you like. And although this is very much part of a lot of religious views, it's a narrative which really spans pretty much every metaphysical model, although not all, really. The thing about obedience to God, then disobedience, then reconciliation. So it seems to me that these stories themselves are so rooted in duality that they still haven't proved, actually, that there is any such place as a perfect realm, or such a being as a perfect, omnipotent, perfectly good God. In fact, it seems to me that it actually proves the opposite. It proves, in fact, that there is no metaphysics, there is no God. And this whole narrative, this whole story has been made up for some kind of human psychological catharsis, or to explain the human condition, as it were. But it still doesn't point to any heavenly condition, or heavenly Father, or a heavenly God. It doesn't prove that, or even point to it. It just points at the human being thinking about itself, and thinking, why is it in the mess that it's in? And maybe there's a meaning behind the mess that it's in the sense that the mess will one day somehow be sorted out, and then you'll be able to appreciate perfection in the light of remembering what it was like to live in imperfection. But it doesn't make that much sense somehow. It doesn't seem very logical. It seems almost counterintuitive, really. And surely the other way of looking at all this is that you have a point, you have a spot, a big bang, and you have evolution, and you have the human evolving out of barbarous survival to more and more sophisticated systems of survival, which are also more inclusivist. That is to say, they take into account the rights of other sentient beings to survive. And eventually, the human race, or some race of sentient beings somewhere in the universe, sort of gets it right, evolves into creating a world where it is possible to be creative and be preserving, despite the destructive tendencies of the particular race of sentient beings, you see. And so that would probably make much more sense, but you certainly wouldn't need a metaphysics behind that particular sort of Hegelian view or positive view of evolution and of social evolution and of political evolution. You wouldn't need a metaphysics. So if the Church of Nowhere has this sort of perhaps a utopian view of evolution, that it's going towards some point of perfection in the future, we are becoming something greater than we were 100 years ago, which also seems rather problematic because in many ways, there are things in society 100 years ago which could be argued to be better and more efficient than they are now. So there isn't it. Evolution isn't a one-way street upwards. It can be devolution or evolution downwards as well as upwards or sideways or in any direction you care to think of, really. Evolution is not a sort of a linear a linear journey, if you like, from point A to point B. You can go to point C and all over the place and go backwards and forwards and sideways, and a bit like the Willy Wonka's chocolate factory and the lift that could go in any direction, sort of thing. So anyway, I hope I've shown that the Church of Nowhere can still be considered a religion and a church, despite the fact it has no narrative that tries to sort of explain the human condition. There's no explaining the human condition, really, but maybe, possibly, either on an individual or collective level, you can actually improve on the human condition, and people get back to sort of moral fundamentals, as it were, in order to create a better world for humans and all sentient beings to live in. So that's my little take on metaphysics part 2, which the Church of Nowhere might think about.